Welcome to the digital classroom. I hope you're doing well. And welcome to the last textbook presentation for this term. All right, we're going to be doing chapter 7 and looking at this idea of the nature of adolescence, right? So with a lot of these different age steps, we're exploring it from the nature side, where we're looking a lot at the physical and cognitive development that happens during that time period. And then in chapter 8, the next chapter, which for you will actually be next term, we'll flip it and look at the social emotional dynamic, just like we've been doing with all the other ages. Hope you're doing well. Grab a coffee and let's get into it. Miss yous and you know, stay strong. I know it's the busy, stressful time of the year, but I have great faith in you, and um, you're close to the break, so just keep your head down and keep fighting hard. All right, let's get into the presentation. This very first sentence comes straight from the textbook, and I thought I caught it pretty good. It's like in matters of taste and manners. So like in what people are, taste, what they're interested into, whether it's like media and music and style of dress and all that kind of stuff, and then manner, like how you behave. The young people of every generation have seemed unnervingly radical and different from adults, right? So it's like everybody's like every generation. Once you get to a certain old age, you're like, the kids these days, and then eventually the people you're saying that about to will be old enough, and they'll be saying, the kids these days, and then eventually the people they're talking about will be old enough, and they'll be saying, the kids these days. And that one of the things that's like so interesting about this emerging adult, right, this teenager, is that they're in this almost secondary growth spurt, right? There's no time where your body changes as much as during puberty, except the first couple years of life, right? So it's like this second huge developmental period. And if you look at puberty, and I know that you obviously know what puberty is, so but I want to kind of make this point that it's really initiated by this brain neuroendocrine process, right, that occurs early in adolescence. And if you think about your endocrinatic system as like your endocrine system, and then if you look at like the word neural, right, brain, how the brain connects to your endocrine system, basically think of your endocrine system as your hormones, right? And you've definitely heard that before in like high school health class or whatever, that like your hormones, the puberty is related to hormones. But this specific idea that it's like the brain knows when to send the signal from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to tell the pituitary to start all this process, right? These primary and secondary changes, these dramatic changes in both height and weight, that affects both boys and girls, and it tends to affect girls almost 2 full years earlier. I'll explain like a little bit more nuance to that comment as we get into this. If you look at in early adolescence, okay, girls tend to outweigh boys. By 14, that's switched, right, to boys tending to outweigh girls. And it's this interesting thing that this growth spurt seems to be about 2 years apart, right? And like if you look at that chart on the right that's showing how much height is being gained per year, and you see that the growth spurt that the yellow line goes through, right, is like a little bit before 12, whereas the growth spurt that the male red line goes through is like closer to 14. So you can kind of see how, in terms of height gain, that females go through their growth spurt almost 2 full years earlier in general, right? And that's not even speaking about, like, I know that you've probably heard how females develop socially and kind of emotionally earlier, about 2 years earlier also, right? And it's actually really interesting that how all this connects. And so, and the reason why this all connects is because this is such deep biology that's heavily influenced by hormones. These chemicals that are secreted, and I know like, this is kind of one of these scenarios where I totally get that all of you know these words, so I just want to kind of highlight the essence of this, right? That really this hormone is a messenger, right? It's like something that is secreted from a gland, which basically just means it's stored somewhere and it's released, and it travels somewhere through your blood, and it interacts with an organ, and it makes that organ do something. And that's actually pretty interesting that these messages are being sent biochemically. And okay, so tremendous physical changes occur during adolescence, and it reflects this HPG idea, right? So you can just see how it's like the hypothalamus, and you can think of that as the part of the brain that is engaged in like a whole bunch of stuff, but in this sense is sending the initial message that, okay, it's time to start the puberty process. It sends a message, chemical message, to the pituitary gland, another part of the brain. That then sends its messengers, they secretes these hormones, right? Pituitary gland. Anything that's a gland is like a sac that holds those chemicals. So the pituitary gland secretes these hormones. Okay, so the pituitary gland is an important endocrine gland that controls the growth and regulates other glands by releasing its own hormones. And those hormones then go to the G in that, which is the gonads. So that's the testicles in males and the ovaries in females. Okay, so yeah, puberty. Okay, so I have two quick videos because I thought it'd be kind of interesting to just look at how, well, what hormones are in terms of this chemical messenger idea. Okay, again, and we're not going to spend like hours on the biology here, but I just kind of want to really make this point that this is like, in some ways, the most interesting thing about puberty is that although it affects people differently and in different cultures it's maybe expressed differently or whatever, it's like so interesting that hardwired into the human being is this predisposition towards having this second turbocharged developmental period in the early teenage years.
The endocrine system is composed of 10 glands in different parts of the body. When the endocrine glands are stimulated, they produce molecules called hormones and release them into the vascular system.
Right, so when they're stimulated, they create these hormones, release the hormones into the blood.
Hormones are like chemical messengers, transported by the blood to target cells. When it reaches a target cell, the hormone attaches itself to a specific receptor, which triggers a physiological process such as cell division.
So you use cell division as the example, but the main point is just that, and again, this is where I want to challenge you to just kind of let your mind relax on the fact that you've already heard of what a hormone is, and just think about this idea that it is actually quite interesting that your body sends messages to other part of your body using biochemical messengers, these hormones, these glands that are able to secrete multiple chemicals, and some of those chemicals will cause different results. Will cause different reactions. They send different messages to the organs, and they shape how the organs function.
Production of many hormones is controlled by two small structures located at the base of the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is composed of nerve nuclei that control vital functions such as sleep. The hypothalamus also controls the pituitary gland, which is the main hormone-producing gland. The pituitary gland alone secretes 9 different hormones. Vasopressin, for example, regulates kidney functioning.
Yeah, so think about that. So the pituitary gland, we always think of it in association oftentimes with puberty, but it can secrete all these, I think it's 9 different chemical messages, right? So they can do 9 different things, which is actually pretty amazing, right? It can get basically triggered from this other message from the hypothalamus that basically tells it which of those ones to release, and then it releases that one, and then that creates this effect. So that's why it's that HPG. It's not just the pituitary has to be told to do it.
Oxytocin causes contractions of the uterus during childbirth. Other pituitary hormones control skin pigmentation and bone growth. Together, The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland produce a third of the body's hormones.
Third of the body.
They therefore have an effect on many physiological processes.
Dun, 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 dun. Okay, so I hope that actually worked okay. I usually don't record myself when I record the videos, but I think that worked alright actually. Alright, I have one more quick one like this, and then these are the only 2 videos I have in here today.
What are hormones? A hormone is a chemical messenger that is secreted or released into our bloodstream by specific organs known as glands. Hormones regulate or control many processes in our body, including blood glucose levels, water content in blood, general growth, and blood pressure, just to name a few. As an example, thyroxine, which is a hormone secreted by your thyroid gland, helps to regulate metabolism. In other lessons, you will learn about a few of these hormones in more detail. Several hormones are secreted by the pituitary gland, located right below the hypothalamus in your brain. Instructions are given by the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland according to current conditions in our body. The secreted hormones travel through the bloodstream to target organs where either a specific response is directly produced, or it stimulates or causes the target organ to secrete its own hormones. We can think of this like a post office system. Hormones, or posts, must reach the correct target organs or addresses for the right response to occur. Feeling thirsty? When the hypothalamus detects low levels of water in blood, it signals or tells the pituitary gland to release a hormone called the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, into your bloodstream. ADH travels to your kidneys, in this case the target organ, and causes water to be absorbed, so urine becomes more concentrated and output is decreased. Drinking more water increases the water content in your blood, which then causes the hypothalamus to signal the pituitary gland to secrete less ADH. Less ADH means your kidneys will absorb less water, causing urine to become less concentrated and output is increased. Ever felt suddenly frightened? When threatened, the brain activates neurons that stimulate the adrenal gland located right above your kidneys to rapidly secrete adrenaline. Adrenaline then acts on your heart and lungs to increase heart rate and breathing rate. This, along with other physiological responses, is known as the fight or flight response and is activated very quickly. At the same time, the hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland to secrete the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which travels to the adrenal glands to secrete a hormone known as cortisol. Cortisol acts in target organs to allow the body to adapt long-term to stress. So to review, hormones are chemical messengers secreted by glands into the bloodstream and produce a specific response when they reach the target organ.
So, in terms of the female experience of puberty, menstruation comes rather late in the pubertal cycle and can be influenced by a bunch of things, and things like body weight play a huge role, or can play a big influencing role, and it can be body weight on either side. It can be if the woman is struggling with body weight in terms of like obesity, or if she's struggling with low body weight. They can both affect the onset. Single parent families, kids that are in single parent families often will start having their period earlier. This is consistent with evidence that father's absence predicts early menarche, right? Like early first menstruation. Adolescents preoccupied with their bodies can develop images of what their bodies are like, which become more positive with age. And we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of like body image today. And this is like one of the most difficult parts of this stage as the child, or as the teenager, as the child is becoming the teenager, right? Adolescence, this like training to be an adult. They're in this in-between period, and we're going to talk in the beginning of the next course about how, like, in chapter 8, we're going to get into how this is all playing out because you're like socially at high school and you're dealing with identity and you're dealing with like trying to make sense of the world and maybe dating for the first time and all this kind of stuff. And that's like high school is probably the most charged social time in your life. And then your emotional experience is so deep as a teen because your entire system around emotional reception and experience is completely developed. So teens feel things super deeply. And then what we're talking about here is that, like, add that to the fact that there's these major changes happening physically, biophysically. One thing, and again, I don't want to spend, I'm not going to spend a whole presentation like trying to teach you all about the science of puberty. I understand that you've obviously like heard of it before and studied it before and and are human beings that went through it, so you know of it intimately. But it's like, but there is like some specific interesting points I want to make, and this is one that always, when I teach my Kitchener students, we always have like interesting discussions about this, that the findings in developmental psychology are a little bit interesting in this area of what happens to people's experience if they mature ahead of their peer group, right? And how it tends to be experienced very differently between men and women, or between, yeah, boys and girls, or men and women. You kind of were in this in between stage at this point, age wise. But you got to apply to what the reasons might be, and a lot of the reasons are going to be like social related reasons, that basically when females mature ahead of their peer group, they actually, when reflecting back on it, tend to view that as a more negative thing. And then you have to ask, why is it that they start to get treated maybe by guys differently, or is it because that they maybe become more self-conscious quicker, or is it because, well, and then there's like the huge obvious element of like media and body image, and nowadays, like the whole like social media element of it, the whole element that you've maybe heard me rant a lot about like the whole advertising industry's focus on that age group. And then almost the flip with guys, right? But then if you think about it too, it's like, okay, well, think about if you're a guy and you mature earlier, you're probably, the main thing is that you're just bigger. And for so many things, that whether we're talking about like sports or like bullying at high school, like there's just advantages oftentimes for males when they're bigger physically. Again, this is like a very fun, or not, I mean, fun, and I should have said like almost intellectually stimulating conversation to have in person, right? Like, and the sad aspect of it is that, like, what the girls that report this as being a negative experience also tend to report it as being associated with developing other types of habits that you would consider, like, well, there I say, like, early maturing girls are also more statistically prone to like smoking, alcohol use, depression, eating disorders, increased independence, which like sounds like a positive thing, but remember we're talking about like early teens, and then like earlier sexual activity. So it's, all the things that as a dad you kind of are worried about, right? It's so, yeah, back to the kind of subtitle of the slide: adolescents who mature earlier or later than their peers perceive themselves differently. It's kind of interesting point, right? So I want to read something to you, and then I'll talk a little bit about the page here. Recall that nearly twice as many synaptic connections are made as will ever be used, right? So your brain's making twice as many connections as you need. That these connections that we do use are strengthened and survive and myelinated, we would say, while the unused ones are replaced by other pathways, or they disappear. In the language of neuroscience, we would say that these connections are pruned, right? Like pruning a plant. I've talked to you about like that before. As a result of this pruning, by the end of adolescence, individuals have fewer, more selective, more effective neuronal, like brain connections than they did as children. So they have less connections, but the connection, it's almost like they have less connections, but the connections that they have are like high powered and better and more functional and more dynamic and advanced, and it's a fine-tuned system. This pruning indicates that the activities in which adolescents choose to engage and not engage in influence which neural connections will be strengthened and which ones will disappear. Using fMRI brain scans, scientists have discovered that adolescent brains undergo significant structural changes. The corpus callosum, okay, so you see that represented by the green in the picture, where nerve fibers connect the brain's left and right hemispheres, thickens in adolescence, improving the adolescent's ability to process information. Earlier in this course, we discussed the development of the prefrontal cortex, right? Like the front part of the brain. However, the prefrontal cortex doesn't finish maturing until the emerging adult period, roughly 18 to 25. Right, so it's like, that's an interesting point about the brain. It's like not everything's developing at the same speed. It's not like your brain's like 3% done, and then 9% done, and then 80% done, and then like 90% done, and then I know that was a huge jump, and then like 99% done, and then 100% done, and everything's done. It's like, no, different things are developing at different speeds. And you've heard me rant about this before, because I find it pretty interesting. Like, the best example I have is just how the child's eyesight's like basically adult level by 1 year, but their hearing isn't until about 6 years. So that's just an example of how those two sensory organs within the brain, or tools of the brain, I should say, develop with different speeds. Right, because you got to think, like, your ability to hear a sound behind you and know what side it was on, some of that's your actual ear, and a lot of that, though, is your brain. Just like a lot of vision is your brain. Okay, sorry. I got on a sub-point there. At a lower level, I'm going to talk about the limbic system now, which we would call subcortical, right? So under the cortical layer, under the wiggly part, you know, the part that they say looks like a wet or a shrunken cap, or a wet cap. They used to always say wrinkled cap, which is, you know, you could just say the wrinkly part. So underneath that, subcortical, the regions of the brain located below the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex, or the outer layer of neural tissue of the cerebellum of the brain in humans and mammals. The limbic system, and again, I'm just reading this extra note, right? You don't have to be scrambling to write this down. You can just like write down what's on the screen. It's actually kind of a more short form version. The limbic system, which is the seat of emotions and where rewards are experienced, matures much earlier than the prefrontal cortex and is almost completely developed by early adolescence. The limbic system structure that is especially evolved in emotion is the amygdala. Right, so we've talked about the amygdala as like, that's what's like going intense when you're experiencing intense emotions. That's like associated with the stress response. It's associated with fear, panic, PTSD. It's associated with any kind of extreme emotion. It basically is where it's coming from. In addition to these structural changes, the levels of neurotransmitters change with the onset of puberty. For example, an increase in the neurotransmitter dopamine, which you've heard of, occurs in the prefrontal cortex and in the limbic system during adolescence. So there's a lot of dopamine in both the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system during adolescence, which is interesting. Like that, there's a well, I'll just read the next sentence. If you're wondering why there's so much dopamine there, that researchers think that dopamine plays a key role in this like reward-seeking, risk-taking, sensation-seeking aspect of adolescence. One of the reasons why a teen might be more likely to engage in that kind of behavior is because that dopamine spike is rewarding. Okay, like rewarding in like the classic operant conditioning meaning of it. The teens getting older, which is my classic segue, as the person gets older, they're also trying to like engage in like this emerging sexuality, right? And what's sexuality? It's this idea of like how people's sexual life and experiences interact with them at like an identity level to a certain point, right? Especially from the point of what we're looking at here, that the person's getting this like emerging set of feelings, is starting to form an identity that is like complicated, and that it's actually this lengthy process, and it's like happening during sort of the most confusing time period in life because you're at high school and you have all these things, and it's like sexual identity involves activities and interests and styles of behavior and indication of orientation. Many adolescents, when they reflect back, or many people when they reflect back on this time period, report like being in experiences that they were maybe physically, that they were like mature physically enough, but that the emotional aspect of the experience they reflect back on as having been overwhelming. And these last two, it's like I think these would be both really interesting questions to have, is like if we're not, I'm not going to do this, but if we were doing some kind of essay style final test, like why get you to pick one of those 2 points and try to, not from just like an opinion perspective, but try to create like a logic based reason for why you think that's the case, whether you think it's societal or like why you think that like guys that play a lot of sports tend to take more risks in that area, and girls that play a lot of sports tend not to. It actually tends to reduce risk taking. So, or the one above, right, that like social income or social economic status, I meant to say SES, which is just like a common measure of like how much resources a family has, how that affects sexual activity. Okay, so basically I'm just saying that those would both be things that would be interesting paper topics. So I just need to say a few more things here about, so in terms of adolescent pregnancy, that one thing about this is it can create health risks for both mom and the baby. And obviously, like lots of people in the history of humanity have had babies during this time period, and obviously there's a difference between what stage in the adolescence we're talking about. But one of the biggest issues is that adolescent mothers are more likely to have a baby that has low birth weight, and that low birth weight can be it's a huge like red flag in terms of infant mortality, which is like whether the child survives. And it can also affect certain kind of neurological conditions. Adolescent mothers are also more likely to be depressed, more likely to then have to drop out of high school. Although many adolescent mothers resume their education later in life, they'll often never catch up economically with women who postpone childbearing until their 20s. Right, so again, I know this sounds like a very cold slide, and this is obviously talking in extreme generalizations, and but in a developmental psych, we're just looking at this idea, right? It's like, okay, well, if there's something uniquely challenging about conceiving and having a child when you're a teen, it's that there tends to be this issue around body weight. And when a child's born with a really low body weight, that doesn't exist in a vacuum. That has other effects, and those other effects tend to be neurological and also related to things like heart and lungs, which is why survival rates are lower. Okay, so I want to read something to you, but a couple of these first points are just, to be completely honest, just kind of obvious, right? Like, studies, well, I guess, the thing that's important to note is that a lot of patterns that get established during adolescence and early 20s tend to stick with people long term. And so, especially in terms of like eating and exercise and stuff like that, and early obesity is on the increase and has all these long-term health implications. And the main reason early obesity has long-term health implications is because it tends to continue long-term, right? And it tends to be issues with that in the teen years tend to be predictive of issues with that later. right? And then I just have on the next point that there's the positive influence of exercise, especially with reducing amounts of type 2 diabetes. Adolescents' exercise levels is also associated with like their parenting attachment styles and their parenting style, right? Like, so authoritative parenting styles tend to be associated more with kids that exercise. It's like, it's pretty interesting how all this stuff sort of lines up. Your peer relationships, and that kind of makes sense, right? Like if all your friends play sports or like or don't, that would influence you. And then how much like video game and that kind of stuff people are exposed to, especially nowadays, like all those numbers would be. Anyways, I won't go on a rant about screen time, but you know, who hasn't increased their screen time over the last few years? A 2012 position paper released by the Canadian Sleep Society noted two key characteristics of sleep. So there's basically two things to think about sleep. One is the obvious one, like how much you sleep, and then the other one is like the timing of it and how it aligns with your circadian rhythm. And this is why like sometimes a short nap can feel relaxing and sometimes a long nap can feel like you're more tired than before, because it's not just amount of time, it's also how it links with your biorhythms, your circadian rhythm specifically. This research provides evidence that most adolescents get less sleep than they need, and that their circadian rhythm differs from that of children and adults, a shift that's not taken into account in school. Adolescents will sleep an average of 9 hours and 25 minutes a night when given the opportunity, right? So if you have them in sleep studies and you don't wake them up, they'll on average sleep 9 hours, 25 minutes. Most get considerably less than 9 hours of sleep though, especially during the week. This shortfall creates what's called a sleep deficit, which adolescents often attempt to make up for on weekends. In addition to needing more sleep, adolescents experience a shift in their circadian rhythm. Left alone, they'll go to bed much later than younger children and adults, right? So this is kind of interesting. It's like you kind of like want to stay up later and later and later and later as a kid, and then that kind of is like at its absolute peak in his teens, and like some of you probably are nighthawks that stay up super late, and then it starts to come back down as you get a bit older. Adolescents' biological clock undergoes a shift as they get older, delaying their period of wakefulness by about an hour, right? So they don't like feel awake until like an hour later in the morning than they did when they were younger. A delay in the nightly release of the sleep-inducing hormone melatonin, which is produced in the brain's pineal gland, right? Pretty interesting. Seems to underlie this shift. Melatonin is secreted at about 9:30 in younger kids and approximately an hour later in adolescents. So even if you literally look at their brain, they're getting that sleepiness hormone what did I just say, an hour later. Yeah. So it's actually, there's that like neurochemistry or like well, the right way to say it would be endocrinatic, right? So it's like the endocrine system is what how the hormones are influencing it. And that's why at the beginning of the presentation we had that word neuroendocrinatic, which would actually be the best, right? Because that's like how that endocrinatic or hormone stuff system is influencing the brain functions or processing specifically. So, and I know I'm not going to have any pictures, and I'll be relatively short with this slide, because I know this is a tough topic for some people, but eating disorders is another issue that is a significant issue often in adolescence, and it can be influenced by a bunch of things, and whether we're talking about those first 2 points more around substance abuse and just saying that like parenting engagement and like your friend group obviously influences stuff like that. And then with the two common eating disorders, and I wanted to just kind of point your attention to the interesting fact that they both have that nervosa as the second part, and you can really see the word nerves in that word, right? And that these both have an anxiety aspect of them. And anorexia nervosa, or this eating disorder that involves this relentless pursuit of thinness through starvation, is definitely by far most common in females, although men can develop anorexia, it's definitely more common in females. And bulimia is more common in females too, but for if men are going to have one of these two, it's much more likely to have bulimia, which is the eating disorder where this individual is like eating a lot and then engaging in these purge behaviors. And I sometimes say this to the class, it's in some ways, and I don't know how much of an issue it is now, but I know when I was in high school, especially for guys, pressure around things like steroids, which weren't really, I guess you wouldn't really call it an eating disorder, but it was definitely related to like a body image. It's hard to know how, I'm not 100% sure how huge or how big steroids are now, but I can remember when I was in high school in the 90s, like if you were a competitive athlete, like people getting nudged, pressured in that, like, you'd be a lot better at hockey if you were like had 15 pounds more of muscle. Okay, so and the other thing I wanted to say is that when people are struggling with eating disorders, there's actually a lot of literature that people actually can get help. One of the difficult things is oftentimes a person will have to stay at a residential treatment center for because so much of eating is pattern, right? And it's like such a daily, multiple times a day thing that you really have to, it's not just like a talk therapy thing. It's like, although that is part of it, there would also be a nutritionalist working, there'd also probably be a social worker involved, there'd be multiple people and like a doctor, and it'd be a team approach. But my point is that there is a lot of examples of people having a lot of success with those kind of therapies. Okay, so from Piaget's perspective, the interesting thing about adolescence is this next change in their level, right? So if you remember back to the beginning of the course with Piaget, we started with sensory motor, right? That the child's born basically experiencing their world through their senses and through their motor system, and then we talked about what was called pre-operational, and then we talked about concrete operational, and then this last stage is called formal operational. Okay, so I'll read this to you. Those are kind of like the key points that are on the slide there, but formal operational thought is more abstract than concrete operational. They're more, right? So as you're getting older, you're able to think more flexibly, more abstract, picture things and think outside the box more. Adolescents are no longer limited to actual concrete experiences as anchors for thought. They can conjure up make-believe situations, abstract propositions, even events that are purely hypothetical and try to reason them logically. Right? You could ask me like, how did the Russian Revolution and this scene from a movie you saw, what's the connection between those two? And then I have to like try to like hold the idea of what happened in the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks and all this, and then think about whatever you just said, and then try to branch the two of them. And it's like that's a lot of cognitive activity, right? That's like a level of abstraction and of like dynamic imagination that didn't exist before. That abstract quality of thinking during this formal operational stage is evident in this adolescent's increased ability to solve verbal problems, right? So they're getting more and more skilled in that sense. The concrete operational thinker needs to see the concrete elements like A and B and C to be able to make the logical inference that A equals B and B equals C, and then A plus C. Right, I had that written weird. I basically said that like the stage before, when it's a little bit more black and white, right? And it's like, well, if this thing equals this, and then this thing equals this, it's basically like if A equals B and B equals C, then A and C must be the same. Right, so just to say that again, it's just a little bit more abstract, right? It's like if this is the same as this, and this is the same as this, then these two things must be the same. The concrete operational thinker needs to see the concrete elements A, B, and C to be able to make this logical inference that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C also, whereas the former operational thinker can solve that problem just in their head. So again, if that was all confusing, it's just because I didn't read that super clearly. I'm basically just saying that as they're getting into this formal operational stage, their ability to do complex things in their mind and hold a lot of information, and think that that's what the word operation means, right? To like have the information in your head and be able to operate with it, calculate with it. Another indication of abstract quality of thought is their increased tendency to think about thought itself. Accompanying the abstract nature of formal operational thought is thought that is full of idealism and possibility, especially during the beginning of the formal operational stage. Adolescents engage in extended speculation about ideal characteristics, qualities they desire in themselves or in others. Such thought can lead other adolescents to compare themselves with others in regards to such ideals and standards that are often fantasy flights into future possibilities. Interesting way of saying daydream's a fantasy flight. But yeah, it's like they're getting smarter, they're getting more creative. Okay, so I have a couple of the next slides are focusing on this idea of adolescent cognition, and basically what I'm trying to say here is like, what is it about the way the teenager's now thinking that's like different than before, and also sort of unique or characteristic to this adolescent teenage experience? And the first point I want to make is around this idea of hypothetical deductive reasoning, which sounds like more complicated than it is, right? Reasoning is like, what was the reason? You're trying to like explain why things happen, and hypothetical deductive means like you have a hypothesis, you think something's a certain way, and then you deduce to try to see if that's actually, if that all makes sense. And deduction is like a type of science. So this type of problem solving called hypothetical deductive reasoning, which again is like a mouthful, but it's basically just saying like having an idea and then testing it out and using that to explain why you think things, right? That you're just getting more of a scientific mind. Involves creating a hypothesis and deducing. Deducing means like figuring out what led to something in the sense, right, as a way to test the hypothesis. Formal operational thinkers develop hypotheses about the ways to solve problems and then systematically try to figure out, or another way to say that, deduce the best path to approach it. Right, so again, without like going into a large talk about the difference between deduction and then deductive research, and then the other type would be like inductive, the opposite. That's beyond this point, right? That's like basically, that's kind of a boring discussion. That's also like a research methodology style discussion that you'll probably learn about in like the stats class. But for here, just the point is that the teenager's mind is becoming more scientific, more structured in how they're thinking through things. So this next term is easy to misunderstand, right? That adolescents have this like egocentrism, this heightened sense of self, and it's easy to think of that as like a negative, right? Like I'm saying, like they're like arrogant or something, and it's like, well, no, it's more this idea of like, think of how when you were a teenager, you probably cared like what other people thought of you more than any other time, and it's like some of that heightened sense of self is like, that's not necessarily always positive. It's like being focused on yourself, and like, especially in adolescence, very literally your body seems to be characteristic of this type of thinking, right? Of this adolescent type of thinking. Adolescent egocentrism is this heightened sense of self-consciousness of the adolescent. David Elkind, a psychologist, maintains that adolescent egocentrism has two main components. All right, this is what we're going to do on the next slide. One is this idea of an imaginary audience, and the idea of a personal fable. So I'm going to do a slide on both those. Okay, so basically it's this idea that adolescent egocentrism, to understand how this uniquely self-centered, but not in the way you would usually use that word, type of experience of the teenager is, we need to kind of be introduced to these two new concepts, the imaginary audience and the personal fable. So this is kind of interesting, right? That like the imaginary audience, that we all kind of have an idea of, like, think of if you were going to go to school on the first day of high school and your mom got you some shirt and it was a shirt you really didn't like, and you're like embarrassed of what they're going to think of you, and you're like, well, who's the they in that scenario? It's like we start to have this imagined audience, and life's always like that, but it's the most magnified during these high school years. The imaginary audience in adolescence is a belief that others are as interested in them as they are in themselves. And that sounds, again, like I'm saying that they're like arrogant or something, but it's like, no, it's like, think about if you're nervous that your shirt doesn't look cool and you like walk into some party, it's like the chances that other people are even going to notice your shirt or anything, it's like they're not that specifically focused on you. That's where this heightened sense of self idea comes in. It's like the concept of how much people are paying attention to the small, minute things about us is hypersensitized. Adolescents sense that they're on stage in early adolescence, believing that they're the main actors and all others are the audience almost. This imaginary audience can be very discouraging for parents who shift from being their child's hero to being all of a sudden embarrassing. Suddenly, the adolescent wants to walk separately in the shopping mall and is critical of everything from their parents' wardrobe to their behavior. Now all of a sudden they care what their friend thinks about what their parents wearing. It's right there. It's like they're playing to a different audience all of a sudden. So I just want to read this to you, right? You can just write down this basic thing. A sense of uniqueness and invincibility, right? Like we've all heard of, like when you're a teenager, you're obviously not like contemplating your mortality as much as like a 40-year-old would be. And you also have this feeling of like, no one can understand me, right? And especially if you're like going through heartbreak or something, it's like, it feels so, or some problem, it feels so uniquely you. And it is. But I think when you get older, one thing you realize is that like a lot of our human experiences that are different are at the level of how it actually plays out, but a lot of our emotional experiences are similar. So I might not know your life at all, but if we both experience something like betrayal, the connection or the closeness of those emotional experiences is closer than anything in our life story. The personal fable is the part of adolescent egocentrism involving a sense of uniqueness or invincibility. Nobody understands me, particularly my parents. They have no idea what I'm feeling. I had that all in quotes. Adolescent sense of personal uniqueness makes them believe that no one can understand how they feel. As part of their effort to retain a unique sense of personal uniqueness, they can craft stories about themselves that's filled with fantasy in a world that's far removed from reality. These kind of personal fables often show up in adolescents' diaries. And I'm going to have to take the researcher's word on that. But it's just this idea of like, your life never feels as much like it's a movie focused on you as when you're in high school. Life always sort of feels like that because we have two eyes and we experience our life so much through our own visual system and we watch so much video. It's hard not to see that connection, but it's like most and this is sort of the idea with a lot of these ideas in developmental psych. It's not like something like identity or intimacy or autonomy or all these kind of developmental goals aren't also present at different life stages. It's what's kind of the emphasis or what's the central developmental task and challenge of the stage. Okay, so another big thing that's changing, and I'll just give you these terms quick. If you think of executive function, we've talked about this a little bit, but think about the executive as the decision maker, and executive function is basically being an umbrella term, right, that includes a bunch of things and everything related to this kind of higher end decision-making processes within the prefrontal cortex. Diana Kuhn and this is in 2009, discusses important characteristics of adolescent information processing and thinking. She argues that large individual differences in cognitive levels are achieved during late childhood and adolescence, in contrast with the largely universal cognitive levels of young children, right? So like, even though there's obviously like smarter little kids than, like in a grade 2 class, some kids are going to be smarter than others, obviously, but you start to see a bigger gap between peers as you start to get into the teen years. The difference between the smart kid and the least smart kid in the class is much bigger. This variability supports the argument that adolescents are producers of their own development to a greater extent than children. That is, that adolescents are more likely than children to initiate changes in thinking rather than depending on others, such as parents or teachers, to direct their thinking. Kuhn argues that the most important cognitive change in adolescence is this improvement in executive function, this umbrella-like term that consists of a number of high-level cognitive processes linked to the development of the prefrontal cortex. Executive function involves managing one's thoughts to engage in goal-oriented behavior, right? So it's like focusing on what you want to focus on. That actually involves like a certain amount of work and a certain amount of not paying attention to other things, and discipline. Cognitive control would be another word for that type of discipline. Cognitive control involves effective control in a number of areas, including controlling attention, right? So paying attention includes like paying attention, paying attention, but also not being distracted, right? So like, for you to pay attention to this presentation, you need to do two things. You need to pay attention to what I'm saying, and you also have to resist the urge to basically think about something different. So let me just read that again. Cognitive control involves effective control in a number of areas, including controlling attention, reducing interfering thoughts, and being cognitively flexible. Cognitive control continues to increase in adolescence and emerging adulthood. Controlling attention is a key aspect of learning and thinking in adolescence and emerging adulthood. Distractions that can interfere with attention come from outside and can also come from intrusive distractions from inside, such as worrying or self-doubt or emotionally heavy thoughts. One of the biggest social transitions that'll happen in your life, and the only one that might be bigger, is going to school for the first time in like preschool or kindergarten, depending on your scenario. But this is definitely right up there, if not the biggest transition, is going from grade 8 to grade 9. And this is often talked about in the literature as this top dog phenomena, right? Like, you were the oldest, biggest, most powerful students in grade 8. Then you switch to grade 9, and all of a sudden you're the young ones again, right? You're back at the bottom of the hierarchy, and not only that, you're in this like bigger institution with this less personal, right? If you ask students, oftentimes their critique of college or of high school level curriculum is that the teachers often fail to make the content relevant. And actually, if you think about it, some of your favorite teachers were probably the ones that's not true about, right? Probably the ones that tried their best to try to focus on why you should care about, or why things are relevant. But I can certainly think of teachers that I had that failed to make things relevant. Adolescents can become immersed in complex peer group culture that demand conformity, right? So here's the other interesting thing, is like, we know this pretty clear, that the age group that's most susceptible to peer pressure is people right around that grade 8-9 age. Students drop out for many reasons, and one thing to note that's interesting is when you ask young men that have dropped out of high school why, they often will say either that they felt uninvolved, and as a side note, that's becoming a more and more common response of men dropping out of secondary as well, and it's actually a major issue. Or the need to make money. And young women, it's often around things like family issues or things around pregnancy or having young kids. And obviously those are generalizations based on like asking people, self-report data. Okay, that's the last slide for today. This presentation is by far the shortest. I'm not totally sure why. It's just kind of like the nature of this presentation, and also just it's kind of a transition presentation to end this one and this term. And okay, so let's do some quiz review. I'll make a final point at the end. All right, my friends, lightning round quiz review. Many stereotypes of adolescence are too negative. Most adolescents today successfully negotiate the path from childhood to adulthood. However, too many of today's adolescents are not provided with adequate opportunities and support to become competent adults. It's important to view adolescence as a heterogeneous, meaning like lots of difference, group, because different portraits of adolescence emerge depending on the particular set of adolescence being described. Kind of obvious. Puberty determinants include nutrition, health, heredity. Hormonal changes occur in puberty, and they're substantial and significant. Puberty occurs approximately 2 years earlier for girls. Individual variation in puberty is substantial, meaning like there's a lot of difference at an individual level. Adolescents show considerable interest in body image, with girls having more negative body image than boys in general. And that's a trend that continues into the early 20s at least. Early maturing girls are more vulnerable to a number of risks. Number 3, changes in the brain during adolescence involve the thickening of the corpus callosum and a gap in maturation between the limbic system, which sets the seat of emotions, and the prefrontal cortex, which functions in the reasoning and self-regulation. So basically they're saying like there's a gap in how fast, meaning there's a difference. The limbic system develops really quick, the prefrontal cortex doesn't develop till later, so you have this like emotional red hot system without the ability to press the brakes yet or self-regulate quite yet, which is associated with risk taking and all this other stuff. Adolescence is a time for sexual exploration and experimentation, or a time when that tends to happen. Early activity is associated with a variety of negative outcomes. Adolescence is a critical juncture in health. Poor nutrition and the lack of exercise are especially concerning. Many adolescents stay up later than when they were children, and are getting less sleep than they need, right? So sleep's like a big health issue. Interesting thing about sleep is the more tired you are, the less good you are at telling how tired you are, which is a pretty wild and unfortunate aspect of the human anatomy, right? But that's an interesting point, right? That if you have people and they rate themselves, and as people get more tired, they start to accept an aspect of that tiredness as like normal, which makes sense because we habituate to anything to a degree. But yeah, we're not the best judges of how much sleep we need. Okay, number 7, and just on that last point, when I said we're not the best judges of how much sleep we need, I mean when we're in a state of sleep deprivation. Okay, number 7, although drug use in adolescence has declined in recent years, and again, it depends what stats you're using, and this is the pandemic definitely changed this, it's still a major concern. It's a massive concern post-pandemic. Eating disorders are also increased massively during the pandemic, have increased in adolescents, with substantial increases in the percentage of adolescents who are overweight. We talked about anorexia and bulimia. In Piaget's formal operational stage, thought is more abstract, idealistic, and logical than during the concrete operational stage. However, many adolescent thinkers and even adults are not formal operational thinkers, right? So Piaget didn't think that everyone made it to that stage necessarily, even though the people that did, it happened in adolescence. It's like some people don't reach that level of abstraction. Number 10, adolescent egocentrism, which involves this heightened sense of self-consciousness, reflects another cognitive change in adolescence. Changes in information processing in adolescence are mainly reflected in improved executive function, right? So one of the reasons why they're able to basically think better and at a higher quality is because their whole toolkit around paying attention and staying focused is getting stronger and stronger. The transition to middle or junior high school is often stressful. One of the sources of the stress is this movement from the top dog to the lowest position in the school in terms of just age and social hierarchy. And my friends, that's going to do it. This is the end of the presentation. This is the end of the chapter presentations for this course. All right, and if you see the schedule, I still have a thing about dreams coming, but this will be the last thing that you get graded on, right? So now you just have to, you have your 2 digital workshops, right? You got in the first one, you have the second one on the key concepts, and then yeah, just these quizzes. All right, reach out if you need anything. Thanks for being an awesome class. I've really enjoyed everything with NIPSing, and when you all reach out to me and stuff, you show a lot of kindness and thoughtfulness, and just you seem like authentic, cool people, and I'm hyped to be your teacher, and I won't get all corny or I won't get all like sappy on you, but just wanted to say I appreciate you deeply. So cheers. Catch you in 2023. Although I still have to do marking and stuff, and I still have another presentation, but I'm just done the chapter presentations. All right, good luck on the quiz, and I hope you're doing all right.